So this is a video to go through activity 2C on Unit 1 Matrix B, which is the compound sorting and naming worksheet. So let's get started. So our first element on here is SCl6. And the first thing we need to decide, based on our mastery flowchart for chemical naming, is does it have a metal in it? So looking at our periodic table, we can see that sulfur is over here in the nonmetals, as is chlorine. So we have two nonmetals here. So no, this does not have a metal in it. The next question is it an acid? Which means, is the first element hydrogen? The first element is not hydrogen. This is not an acid. So our final question is, are there two elements, meaning two types of elements, or are there more than two types of elements? So continuing on, we just have sulfur and chlorine, so we're going to go down the two element side, which is going to take us to binary covalent, which is naming rule number 5 if you go to your guide to chemical naming. So binary covalent, let's see, binary covalent number 5, so I'm going to write SCl6 there. And I'm going to check that off so I know that I've already done that one. Let's keep going across. NABR. So going back to our chart, does it have a metal in it? Looking at our periodic table, you see sodium all the way over here, and it is indeed a metal. It is a main group metal, which brings us to our next question. It says, yes, it has a metal, main group or transition. And we already said that it is indeed a main group metal. The transition metals are, remember, here in the middle of the periodic table. Sodium, so let's see, main group metal. So does it have two elements or does it have more than two types of elements? So we just have sodium and bromine here, so that is two elements, meaning this is simple binary ionic, which is number 1. So let's see, simple binary ionic. And put NABR. All right. Keep going here. We have SCOH with a 3 outside the parentheses. So let's come back to our trusty chart here. Does it have a metal? So SC, we need to find that on the periodic table. And SC, we're searching around. Let's see, SC, scandium, right there. So it is in the transition metal section, because I know that's going to be my next question. Yes, it has a metal, main group or in transition. This is a transition metal. Are there two elements or are there more? So coming back up here, I have scandium, I have oxygen, and I have hydrogen in this formula. So there are more than two types of elements. So we're going to go more than two types of elements. This is ternary ionic with a transition metal, which is rule number 4. Ternary ionic with transition metal number 4. So we're going to put SC parentheses OH3. All right. Next we have V2SO43. So first of all, does it have a metal? Vanadium, capital V. Looking at our periodic table, we see vanadium right here, number 23. And it is indeed a metal. In fact, it's a transition metal again. So, let's see. Yes, it has a metal. It's not a main group. It is a transition metal. So do we have two elements or do we have more? So coming back up, we have vanadium. We have sulfur and oxygen, so that's 3 types of elements, more than 2. Ternary ionic with a transition metal, which is rule number 4. Let's see, V2SO43. Next up, we have NH4F. Okay. So this one's a little bit trickier. Let's see. So we have, does it have a metal? Well, looking at our periodic table, nitrogen is a nonmetal. Hydrogen is also a nonmetal. And fluorine is a nonmetal. So no, it does not contain a metal. So we're going this way. Is it an acid? Meaning, is the first element hydrogen? And looking up here, NHF, the first element is not hydrogen. Hydrogen's in the middle. So this is not an acid. Does it have two elements or does it have more? And we have nitrogen, hydrogen, and fluorine, so that's more than two elements. If we follow that along, that tells us that this is ternary ionic. Now I want to, we'll go ahead and put this on our sheet as ternary ionic, which is rule number 3. NH4F. But I want to draw your attention to this particular compound because this is a type of ionic compound that does not contain a metal. This only happens when we have a positive polyatomic ion. And NH4 is a polyatomic ion that has a positive charge, a polyatomic cation is what we call this. I'm going to take a note there, polyatomic cation. Just so we remember that for later. All right. Next up, we have CaCO3. So first of all, does it have a metal? Calcium, Ca, is right here in the periodic table. So it is a main group metal. Coming back to our chart, yes, it has a metal, and it's main group metal. So then we just need to decide if it has two elements or more. Ca is one element, C, carbon, is another element, and oxygen is a third type of element. So this does indeed have more than two types of elements, meaning it is ternary ionic, rule number 3. Let's see, CaCO3, rule number 3, ternary ionic, CaCO3. Next up, H3PO4. So first, does it have a metal? So we need to look at our periodic table. Hydrogen is a nonmetal. Phosphorus is also a nonmetal. And oxygen is also a nonmetal. So the answer, does it have a metal? The answer is no. So next, is it an acid? Meaning, is the first element hydrogen? Looking up, the first element is indeed hydrogen. So yes, this is an acid. Does it have two elements or does it have more? Well, we have hydrogen, we have phosphorus, and we have oxygen. So that is more than two types of elements, which leads us to it being a ternary acid, which is naming rule number 7. Ternary acid, H3PO4. Next we have H2SO3. So does it have a metal? Well, we already said hydrogen's a nonmetal, right over here. Sulfur is a nonmetal, and oxygen's a nonmetal. So no, it does not have a metal, but yes, it does start with hydrogen. So it is an acid. And once again, we have hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen, more than two types of elements, so it is another ternary acid. Ternary acid, H2SO4. Next on this line, we have GaCl3. So does it have a metal? Gallium, Ga, right here on the periodic table, group 13. So gallium is a metal. Next up, so yes, it is a metal. Is it main group or transition? Gallium is actually considered a main group metal in group 13. It's not part of these ones in the middle, and it's not tin or lead. It's a main group metal over here. So main group metal. Next, does it have two elements or more? So we have gallium, and we have chlorine. So that's just two types of elements. So it's simple binary ionic. Whoops, I'm off the screen. Simple binary ionic, which is number 1 on our naming rules. Simple binary ionic, GaCl3. Next up, we have N2O3. N2O3. All right, does it have a metal? Well, Looking at our periodic table, nitrogen is a nonmetal, as is oxygen. So the answer is no, it does not have a metal. Does it start with hydrogen? Meaning, is it an acid? It does not start with hydrogen. It is not an acid. So the final question, are there two elements or more? So we have nitrogen and oxygen, only two types of elements, which means that two elements gives us a binary covalent compound. Once again, I'm off the screen, but binary covalent. All right, so let's put that one in binary covalent. N2O3. So let's skip this one right here, and let's do Cu2O. Cu2O. So let's find copper on the periodic table. It's right here in the transition metal section of the periodic table. So yes, it has a metal, and it is a transition metal. So the last question is, does it have two elements or does it have more? So we have copper and oxygen, so just two types of elements, which brings us to binary ionic with a transition metal, which is rule number 2. Cu2O. This next one, Ag3PO4. So first, does it have a metal? Silver, Ag. It's right here on the periodic table. It's number 47. It is a transition metal, but it's actually a kind of tricky transition metal because silver, cadmium, and zinc always have a consistent charge. Even though they're in the transition metal section, they only have one oxidation state or charge. So we actually don't consider them according to the naming conventions, they are essentially not transition metals. So we're going to say, no, this is not a transition metal, even though it's in that section. So yes, we have a metal, but it is a main group metal. And then finally, two elements or more. We have silver, we have phosphorus, and we have oxygen. So that is more than two types of elements. So it is a ternary ionic compound. Number 3, ternary ionic. Ag3PO4. Next up, we have YCl, yttrium, and chlorine. So does it have a metal? Well, yttrium is in the transition metals right here. So yes, it has a metal and it is a transition metal. So let's look at our chart. Yes, we have a metal and it is a transition metal. So are there two elements or are there more than two types? So we have yttrium and we have chlorine. That's just two types. So two types of elements gives us binary ionic with a transition metal, number 2. And then last but not least, let's come down to the next couple rows and look at HBr. So HBr, does it have a metal? Well, hydrogen's a nonmetal. Bromine is also a nonmetal. So no, it does not have a metal. There are no metals in HBr. Is it an acid? Meaning, is the first element hydrogen? And yes, of course, HBr, the first element, is hydrogen. So it's an acid. And are there two elements or are there more than two elements? And looking back up here in HBr, you can see clearly that there are only two types of elements. Two elements, which makes this a binary acid, number 6. HBr is a binary acid. And then we're going to move over to KCl and this dot in the middle, and then H2O. So this is the one thing that your flow chart does not really do here. Anything with this dot and then the H2O after it, so KCl times H2O, that's going to be considered a hydrate, meaning it is an ionic salt that has absorbed water. So we're going to put KCl times H2O here. And then you can also see Al2O3 times 7H2O. That's also a hydrate. So I'm going to put that here as well. Al2O3 times 7H2O. And you can keep going through this process over and over again. The more you do it, the more natural it will become and the easier it will get for you. But being able to sort compounds is super duper important for being able to name compounds, because if we can't sort them appropriately, then we won't know what naming rule to follow. And this just does take practice, so go through the rest of these, use your chart until you can do this by memory, and then eventually you should get to the point where these questions are second nature to you, and you're automatically asking, does it have a metal? Is it a main group or a transition metal? Is it an acid? Does it have two elements or does it have more? And you will get to the point where you can do this without using your flow chart.